On July 2, 1937, at 7:42 in the morning, a radio operator aboard the US Coast Guard cutter Itasca picked up a woman's voice, thin and breaking through the static. "We must be on you, but cannot see you. Gas is running low." It was Amelia Earhart, 40 miles from a runway she would never reach. Minutes later, the voice went silent. No wreckage, no bodies, no final transmission. For 89 years, the most famous disappearance in the history of flight has resisted every search, every theory, every expedition sent to solve it. Now, in the last 12 months, 3 separate threads, a declassified archive, a bone measured 85 years ago, and a shape spotted in satellite water have converged at the same time. And for the first time, researchers are saying this out loud. They might actually be close. So what actually happened to her? For decades, the official position never changed. Earhart's plane ran out of fuel and went down in the open ocean near Howland Island, and the wreckage sank beyond recovery. It's the simplest theory, and probably the most likely one. But it never fully satisfied anyone. Not the historians, not the family, and certainly not the wilder corners of the internet, which spent decades insisting she was secretly a Japanese prisoner or a spy or living under a new name in New Jersey. Most of that has been thoroughly debunked. But one competing theory never went away, because unlike the others, it kept generating physical evidence. That theory says Earhart didn't crash into open water at all. She missed Howland Island, turned south along a known navigational line, and came down near a tiny, uninhabited atoll called Nikumaroro, close enough to land the plane on the reef, far enough that no one ever thought to look there in time. For years, this was treated as a fringe idea. But the evidence supporting it didn't come from theorists. It came from a government archive that stayed sealed for 88 years, and from an old, half-forgotten box of bones. In September 2025, the White House ordered every federal record connected to Amelia Earhart declassified. FBI files, State Department cables, Navy correspondence, all of it. The National Archives began releasing the material in batches, and by January 2026, thousands of pages were public for the first time. Most of it confirmed what historians already suspected. But buried in the paperwork were details researchers hadn't had access to before. Internal doubts about the official search radius, and correspondence suggesting the US Navy considered the Nikumaroro area a real possibility back in 1937 and quietly moved on from it. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was enough to send researchers back to an old, uncomfortable piece of evidence they'd been arguing about for decades. In 1940, a British colonial officer on Nikumaroro found a partial human skeleton, along with a woman's shoe, a sextant box, and an empty bottle of Benedictine liqueur, the exact drink Earhart was known to carry. The bones were shipped to Fiji and examined by a physician named D.W. Hoodless, who measured them by hand and concluded they belonged to a stocky, middle-aged man. Case closed. The bones themselves were later lost. For 60 years, that verdict stood as the reason nobody took Nikumaroro seriously. Then, in 2018, a forensic anthropologist named Richard Jantz went back to Hoodless's original 7 measurements, the only thing that survived, and ran them through Fordisc, the same software nearly every board-certified forensic anthropologist in the country uses today to estimate sex and ancestry from bone dimensions. Hoodless had done his analysis by eye in 1940 with the medical standards of his time. Jantz's software told a different story. According to his analysis, the bones were statistically more similar to Amelia Earhart's known body proportions than to 99% of individuals in a large modern reference sample. Not proof, not a name written on a bone, but a number that was very hard to ignore. A recalculated bone is a strong clue. It is not a plane, and a story about a missing aircraft is never finished until someone finds the aircraft. That's the part that, until very recently, nobody could deliver. In 2024, a separate expedition scanned the ocean floor near Howland Island and found something shaped like a plane on sonar. It made international headlines. Then researchers went back to look closer, and the object turned out to be a rock formation. It was a reminder of how easily this mystery invites people to see what they're hoping to find. But the Nikumaroro lead didn't come from sonar, and it didn't come from deep water. It came from a researcher scrolling through satellite imagery of the island's shallow lagoon, who noticed an anomaly the right size and the right shape, resting in water barely deep enough to hide it. They're calling it the Taraia Object. Nobody is claiming it's the plane. What they are saying is that it's the first lead in this entire case that can actually be tested directly, and a full expedition with sonar, magnetometers, and excavation equipment is scheduled to reach the site within days of this video going live. So is the Amelia Earhart mystery solved? No, not yet, and maybe not ever completely. But for the first time since 1940, 3 independent lines of evidence, the declassified paper trail, the recalculated bones, and a physical object waiting in shallow water, are all pointing in the same direction at the same time. Researchers aren't calling it certainty. They're calling it, in their own words, the most plausible explanation anyone has ever assembled. That's a very different sentence than the one historians have been writing for 89 years. Amelia Earhart didn't just vanish into the Pacific. She vanished into a gap in the evidence, a gap that stayed open for 85 years because nobody had the tools, the access, or the courage to reopen a case the government had already closed. That gap is finally narrowing, not because someone finally solved it, but because science, for once, was patient enough to keep asking. Thank you for watching. If you want to see whether the Taraia expedition finds what everyone's hoping for, make sure you're subscribed. We'll cover it the moment results come in. Let me know down in the comments. Do you think she made it to that island? See you in the next video.